We must start with the news that has shaken up the college football world. Just 1 year removed from an SEC championship game appearance, Dan Mullen is out as the head coach of the Florida Gators. Of course, this happened very quickly on the heels of what's been a very disappointing run over the last 11 games against Power 5 opponents. Just 2-9 were the Florida Gators. Here is the athletic director for the University of Florida, Scott Strickland, on the difficult decision that was made.
I met with Coach Mullen shortly before noon today in his office, and we had a conversation. Just told him I felt like we need to go a different direction for the Gators and our football program, and he understood. It was actually a very productive conversation. Gave him the opportunity to coach the game Saturday against FSU, and after some discussion, and he actually took some time to think about it, he made the decision that he thought he would be a bit of a distraction if he was around this week after this news came out, and so he made the decision to step away and not coach the FSU game.
So you take a look back at Florida's season since 1990 with 6 or more losses. It has not happened often. And, this is a team, Greg, that we knew had a lot to replace, that we knew things were going to be a little bit different. But I'll be perfectly honest, this is one I was wrong on. I thought Dan Mullen was a shoo-in to be successful. I said Dan Mullen would win a national championship at Florida. So it was a swing and a miss on my part with this one. All the talent that was going to be there. You knew he was going to be able to recruit at somewhat of a high level just because it's Florida, and then it has not worked out. After being in the SEC championship game, going toe-to-toe last year with one of the best college football teams we've ever seen, Dan Mullen now out as the Florida head football coach.
What's crazy is it's just amazing of where we're at in college football, just how quickly things can turn. I mean, I was like you. I thought Dan Mullen, we saw him earlier this year give Alabama all they wanted. We saw him really put up remarkable quarterback stats with both Felipe Franks and then Kyle Trask. And then most recently, you thought Emory Jones might be the next guy. And if it wasn't him, it's Anthony Richardson. Well, all that can change in an instant. And I think what's most interesting, you talk to people that are very familiar with the situation. We're going to have plenty of people on to discuss what's going on at Florida over the next 4 hours. Talk to people close to the situation. It felt like what ultimately led to this decision was the gap in roster quality between Florida Gators and where the Georgia Bulldogs are right now. And I know that sounds crazy. You're not going to make a move based on what your rival's doing. But right now, that gap between Florida and Georgia, as far as top to bottom, 85 scholarship players, is significant. And guess what? It's getting wider. Because if you look at the recruiting classes or the lack of recruiting prominence that Dan Mullen's had over the course of his past few years, even dating back to his time at Mississippi State, he wanted to find diamonds in the rough. That wasn't going to be okay at Florida. And I think that's ultimately what led to the decision. Not so much what he's done, but what the program looked like it was going to be in the years to come because of his inability to recruit at the same level as some of the best programs in college football.
I think you asked the question, and you bring up great points from a recruiting standpoint, but from a college football perspective, are we maybe a little bit too paranoid about potential trajectory? What's the forgiveness period now for any coach in college football? And I think it's easy to say after what has happened with Florida this year for Florida fans to say, it's time, get him out, it's done. Guy did some really good things for the university as well and scored a lot of points, put together some good teams, went toe-to-toe with some other great teams like we mentioned. But when that trajectory starts to look like it's going the wrong direction,
it's hard to get it back. It's like a locomotive going out of control, and if you can't kind of slam on the brakes, it can get away from you quickly, Cole. And I think one other thing too, and we'll talk about potential down the road, other guys to consider, other names that we're hearing as who they might maybe take a peek into, and we'll document that over the course of the next 4 hours. But Cole, I think one concerning thing here for Florida is that when Dan Mullen was hired, he was not the number one candidate. It's widely documented that both Scott Frost and Chip Kelly were approached by the brass at University of Florida. Neither one had an interest in taking the job because of some of the things that had gone on in the Jim McElwain tenure.
Sure.
Now, similar circumstances at the very end with how things happened with Dan Mullen. So I guess my question to you, and I think a question that we all need to answer, is this job more attractive or less attractive today after what's transpired the last few years?
I think it's about neutral, personally, because I think the Florida brand is not any less than it was when Dan Mullen took this job. And I think the one thing that we always maybe devalue or discredit about folks who might take some of these jobs is their ego. All these coaches think they can come in and their way is going to work. I've got a plan. We're going to outline it here. Here's how we're going to work. Here's how we're going to recruit. Here's our system. Here's my staff. They think it's plug and go. And when they can plug and go with a massive brand like Florida, then they think that things can just skyrocket. It's like hitting the nitrous in Fast and the Furious. They just think, oh, all of a sudden we're going to be off to 10 wins. So I think that brand has held its weight regardless of what's happened on the field. And most other coaches that might take this job or consider this job would still look at it that way. Yeah. So is it in a worse place? Well, I think what would be different is let's look at the division. Georgia's definitely different. I mean, Georgia was a player, a contender then, but they're not what they are now.
I agree.
I mean, Georgia looks like they are on track to being the next dominant force in college football for the foreseeable future. And then let's just take what's happened this season. Shane Beamer's ahead of expectations.
Yep.
Josh Heupel's ahead of expectations. So now all of a sudden that division that a lot of people were poking fun at, and by the way, Coach Stoops has still got Kentucky on the move. That everybody's saying, "Wow, worst division in college football." It's whatever. All of a sudden that division looks like it might be trending up for the most part, which would make that job even that much more difficult.
Yeah, no question. I mean, you look at Missouri; they're recruiting pretty well. I mean, this is going to be a difficult division where you have to score a lot of points, and it'll be fascinating to see what Scott Strickland does here over the course of the next few months as they take a deep look at some potential candidates.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.